Welcome everybody. Big room. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Matt Donner. I'm co-owner, chief academic officer here at Pyramind. For those of you I haven't seen before, welcome. I see a lot of, obviously, familiar faces. Very, very excited about tonight. We have a very, very special guest, obviously, Mr. Steve Duda. Quick round of applause, if you would, please.
Thank you.
So I'm assuming because you're here, you know maybe a little something, if not a lot of something, about Steve and some of his work. We're going to have him describe some of that right out the gate. But again, just want to say thank you. The format for tonight, obviously, we would prefer, if possible, hold questions towards the end. But if you just can't hold it in anymore, please just raise your hand. I'll either come around and hand you the mic, or we'll grab Steve's attention and then go ahead and ask away. Any comments or questions before we jump into it from anybody? Okay, if you haven't noticed, the bathroom's right outside. Water's there too. The door makes a little noise as you come in and out. We might close the door, so do be a little quiet. Make sure it shuts quietly behind you if you could. Otherwise, be comfortable, have a good time. And once again, Steve Duda. Steve, welcome.
Thank you.
Just want to start right out the gate for those of you who maybe don't know too much about you. If you could go into a little bit of your history, background.
Sure.
Everything from what started getting you into music and where you went from there to here.
Right, yeah. I grew up in a musical family, pretty much sort of classical music background. Here in the Bay Area, I grew up in Menlo Park and went to college and I sort of feel fortunate in high school. Some people have families where their parents really want them to be a doctor or a lawyer, but my parents were sort of like, my mom especially was like, make sure you enjoy what you do for a living because you're going to spend most of your adult life working. And she'd say that to me pretty ever so often my last year of high school. And of course, it was very, I really only heard the last part of it, which was you're going to spend most of your adult life working, and didn't like the sound of that. But as soon as I got to college and I had, was making some new friends, and they're like, I'm going to major in physics and whatnot. I was sort of, sure, I'm going to major in music. It was just sort of a no-brainer to me that that would be something that would help me further my knowledge. Turns out, in the long and short of it, that didn't really, a lot of the knowledge that I gained studying, Western music and the history of that, a lot of that knowledge is really just trivia at this point, and stuff I've never really applied or needed. It was a really rigorous program. I went to UC Santa Cruz, and its music program there, at least at the time, was pretty tough. And at the very end of it, after spending 4 years doing that, the professor said, look around you, there's 11 of you left. There was 200 of you when you started this program, so you should feel proud about yourself, pat yourself on the back. You made it through the program. Now you can go get your master's degree so you can become a teacher, because that's the only way you're going to make a living with music. And so I was sort of a little mad that they wait till the very end of the program to tell you that, but in all seriousness, I also knew that that's not the case. I knew that there's people out there, from pop musicians to recording engineers to composers, that are making a living at music, and that obviously having a music degree wasn't going to hurt me. At the same time, a lot of that time may have perhaps been wasted in retrospect. There was a lot of that knowledge I didn't really gain. After college, Santa Cruz is a lovely town, but not a place with much commerce going on. Sort of a college town and surf town. And I was having a hard time collecting $25 from the bluegrass band that I recorded. So I realized that I wasn't going to make it as an engineer or anything else in Santa Cruz, so I moved here to San Francisco. I worked for Cutting Edge Audio, which is a pro audio dealership, and I was doing installation and training of Pro Tools systems. And that was great because I was hands-on with customers, people, whether it's Sega or Sony or any of these CD-ROM multimedia companies at the time were the big craze. So any of these people that were using high-end audio equipment for a living, I was meeting these people, so I was not only making contacts, but I was getting to see a little glimpse of what they were doing, because ideally that was what I wanted to do. And I had always set myself on that trajectory that I love computers and I love music, and somewhere where these two things kind of meet, that's what I want to do for a living, is work with music and music technology. That's where my passion lay. I never sought to be an artist per se. That was never something I felt like I have this burning music inside me I have to get out or anything like that. Although I did, through high school, through college and all that, I did do a lot of playing. As much as 6 hours a day, I'd sit and play a piano and keyboard, and always have loved synthesizers and that kind of a thing. I just never really saw that as a way to make a living. I didn't say, oh, playing synthesizers for a living, what are you going to do? And I tried to visualize it as a youth, because that's something I really wanted to do. I was like, okay, what would bring me happiness, and it was just sort of a mental exercise, and I pictured myself maybe, you know, playing some gigs with a band in like a little bar, nothing fancy at all, and then maybe giving some piano lessons in my little tiny apartment above the bar. And this little idyllic situation, I thought, that's all I need. That's all I'll really need to be happy. So I never set my goals too lofty, like I don't need, you know, private jets and fancy cars or anything like that to be happy. I just wanted to really be able to work with music for a living, and then technology being sort of the other half of that. So anyway, back to post-college, working at Cutting Edge and going around to all these places. That was cool. My boss said, you should probably go down to Avid and meet all the guys in the tech support there, because you're going to be on the phone with them a fair bit. So I went down to Palo Alto, is where they were based at the time, and they more or less poached me from Cutting Edge. They said, how would you like to work for us? And I said, well, sounds like it'd be good. So I ended up working tech support for Avid, and that was just basically being thrown on the phones. And I was doing the pro products, which was, I guess, the best of possible fates if you're going to be in a cubicle on the phones with angry people all day. At least it was the guys that spent a lot of money. So at the time, those systems, back then, the Pro Tools systems required a lot of cards. If you wanted to do like a lot of audio tracks or a lot of plugins, you would have to buy these expansion chassis that were this, you know, big rack mount units that you could put additional cards in for the computer. So these people mostly had these blown out systems with 10 or so DSP cards. But it was great for me because still I was trying to figure out my future. I knew I wanted to probably work with these systems or this sort of a thing at least for a living. And what better way than to get a feel for what various jobs are out there. And it became clear pretty quick. There was a few different, I sort of divided it mentally into a few different occupations these people seemed to have that were working with these expensive systems. There was film and TV composers. And that was something, of course, having a composition degree, this is something that I considered, this might be you know, a viable, practical living, might be something that I'd be interested in doing. And I have friends that do that for a living, and some of them have done quite well at it, so it's very, potentially very lucrative. So I'm not going to try to dissuade any of you that may have that dream, because it's absolutely a good job if you can do it. But for me, I was looking for something that I would enjoy, once again, doing on a day-to-day basis, actually enjoying my work. And what I found from most of the people I talked to, on the phones at least, is that they were incredibly stressed out. I mean, these people were like, this stuff's not working, and it's your company's fault, and I had my deadline is tomorrow or yesterday, and they're screaming at me more or less that, you know, it's completely stressed out that you know, they're, of course, getting barked at by whatever people are above them on this film or project or whatever. So things seemed incredibly stressful. And then comparing that to other businesses, for instance, people working on albums, which isn't something I had considered too much. I'd studied recording engineering a bit in college, and I considered being a recording engineer. But once I started talking to those people on the phone, it started to seem a little more interesting to me, because they were like, yeah, stuff's not working, but it's a nice day out, and we actually didn't really want to work in the studio today anyway, and what's it like working at Avid? Is that cool? Or do they treat you well? You know, and so I started thinking, that sounds kind of like that could be a good line of work. Working on the album sounds like they're having fun. They're always like in a good mood, even when the stuff's not working. And so considered that. And then there's another line of work that became somewhat prevalent. I'd speak to people that did jingles. And I don't know much about that world, and it's cutthroat in its own ways. I actually know a little bit about it. But the jingle guys were sometimes the happiest guys on earth, because these guys, the guys that are really good at it, for instance, I just remember one guy that sticks out in my head where he's like, yeah, I write jingles January, February, and then I make enough money to take the rest of the year off, so I go travel the world. And so he just seemed like an incredibly happy guy. And jingle writing can be very lucrative if you do well at that, if you have a knack for it, I guess. Anyway, I didn't really foresee a way that I would fall into that, and I haven't. Although later on in my little journey, I almost decided to try to go that route, and kind of, who knows what would have happened, but I think I'm glad I didn't. So anyway, a lot of the clients I was talking to were these high-end users, and one of them that kept calling me was Nine Inch Nails. I gave Charlie Clouser, who was a keyboard player at the time, my direct line, because he had some questions. Nice guy who started talking about technology in general. He just, like me, was sort of a kin of like having techno fetish. This was right when where screens used to be the big CRT monitors, right, and they were just becoming LCD flat screens. And so he was like, oh, have you seen the new 17-inch one you can rotate or whatever? And he starts sending me like pictures of them and stuff like that. And then so I was like, this guy's cool. So I gave him my direct line. And then Charlie would call me up, and sometimes there would be questions about just other stuff. He's like, I don't know if you know. You seem to know a lot of stuff. Like, do you know about this Studio Vision program? And well, I just can't get my plugins window to open now. Like with the menu where you select the plugins, it's just nothing's appearing in it. And I was like, oh, actually, I ran into that myself. You just have to raise your screen resolution. It's like a bug in their thing. If it can't fit the menu, it just doesn't open it at all. He's like, how the hell do you know that? And I was like, well, I collect a lot of plugins too. So I ran into it at home. So anyways, he's basically like, wow, man, you know your stuff. And I was like, hey, if you ever need anyone, I'd be more than happy to leave here and come work for you guys. And just threw it out there. And he was like, yeah, actually, we could use someone to do, backups and some kind of like, I don't know if you want to do that kind of stuff, but we're looking for someone to like, back up the hard disks every night and all that. And for me, I was like just the opportunity to go work, with Nine Inch Nails camp compared to being in a cubicle was sort of like, yes, absolutely, I want to do that. So I took my vacation, I flew out to New Orleans, I did a trial run with them for like a week, and they gave me some sort of test projects to see if I'd be able to like fit the bill for what they were looking for. And one of them was someone that could just edit really good in Pro Tools, because none of them really knew, at least at that time, none of them really knew Pro Tools too well. So I, of course, knew it pretty well working at Avid. I knew it pretty well. I wasn't doing it as a living, so I wasn't like an editor that would fly around with the key commands completely, but I knew the features of the program, and I knew some tricks as well. So they gave me all of these like 24-track tapes that were drums that they had recorded at Steve Albini's studio, and they were saying, we want these all sliced up as individual files instead of just one long file. So take every drum hit, cut it, name it in a certain way, export them into the folders in a certain way, and we're going to give you 3 days to try to do this. And I think I did it in about 2 hours, because I had some macro software that was called Quick Keys that would allow you to just automate keystrokes. And so I was just sort of having it export things for me. I'd just go, 100 times, and it would just repeat, record, and bounce 100 separate regions in one go. Needless to say, that impressed them, because they thought it was going to take a few days. And then the other thing, they're like, okay, well, I think we want to hire you just on that alone, but one of the things we really want is someone to do backups. And I'm kind of rambling here, but basically, I almost put myself out of a job because I knew about network stuff, because at Avid, of course, all the computers are networked together. So I was like, well, why don't we just get a hub, and we can set up a server to automate the backups, and we don't have to move the hard disks all the time. We can just have it automatically go at 4 a.m. or whatever. And they're like, you can do that? It'll work? And it's like, yeah. So I actually set that up my first week, and so it was all set up and automating the backups. Like, do you still want to hire me? And so they ended up still hiring me. I ended up moving to New Orleans. I worked on the Nine Inch Nails record called The Fragile for 2 years. I showed up with all my gear, and Trent's like, oh, you have the General X2. Oh, you have the K2500. Why don't you spend like a few weeks and just make piano sounds? And so there I was, making nothing but piano sounds for a few weeks. And then he'd bring me some other piece of gear. Oh, Yamaha VL virtual lead hardware. Like, see if you can make this do any like fucked up things it's not supposed to do. And you just like drop it on the desk. Okay, so do that. Or a Reactor came out. It used to be called Generator and then when they added the sample features, Native Instruments renamed it to Reactor. So similar there. Like, why don't you spend a month with Reactor? And when would you be able to do that in real life? Just sit down with a piece of software for a month and 18 hours a day, nothing but just mess around with it and see what you can get it to do. So I went in really expecting to learn a lot from Trent and from Charlie and Alan Mulder and these guys, and I did, definitely. But I think I learned, in a way, a lot more just on my own in a room, being forced to create my own solutions. And I think that's a valuable lesson to learn. I'm glad I learned that, not just the stuff that I learned, but the fact that I learned that you can teach yourself, and that solutions, necessity is the motherhood of invention, essentially, right? You get put in situations where you need a solution. You're stuck on a song or whatever it is. Where do you turn? Do you turn to Google? Do you turn to YouTube? Or do you just turn to yourself and say, hey, I think there's multiple solutions here. Why don't I just make one up? And that's generally the road that I follow, and I like to follow, is creating your own solutions. So I learned that there, and working on that record was definitely sort of like a no going back sort of feeling too. Once you've spent 2 years in a studio environment like that, you don't want to go back to a cubicle. You don't want to go back to an office. You want to do more of that. Unfortunately, I was a little spoiled out of the gates, because most albums aren't is cool in a sense as a Nine Inch Nails record where Trent loves technology, and it was just one of my favorite musical artists to begin with going in. So it was going to be a tough act to follow. Sure enough, I moved to LA, and having Nine Inch Nails as a calling card, especially at that time, 1999, it was a really great thing because Nine Inch Nails is known for technology, and that was what I was sort of specializing in, being a Pro Tools operator or engineer with the computer stuff, sound designer, etc. So I had no problem finding work. Basically, I came to LA with $1,000 to my name, 2 phone numbers, basically nothing, but just went from gig to gig, essentially. It didn't take me very long, just a couple years. I had my own house in the hills, really, just from working hard and working on records, record after record. A lot of it wasn't fun. I mean, a lot of it was not the kind of work that I would want to do again, tuning vocals for boy bands or whatever it is. I would take any job that came along because I wanted to make it. My definition of success was just not to have to call my parents and move back home, basically, just to be able to support myself doing music, not to have like a 9-to-5 job, but just to be able to be a freelance guy making it was the dream. That was making it to me. It was just being able to get by on music, on fun stuff, because none of it felt like a job. Even tuning vocals for a boy band, well, okay, that was on the fence. But most of it was fun stuff. And the cool art rock records were few and far between. I mean, I got to work on a couple Perfect Circle albums, and that was cool. But I worked on a lot of pop punk stuff and things that weren't really up my alley in terms of musically speaking. And working in the studio for long hours on music that you don't like almost ruins music for you, because music is this thing you're supposed to love, and now you're hearing this song over and over that you don't like. You start to question, why am I doing this? And eventually that's what ended up happening to me. I was finding that the records that I enjoyed were few and far between the records that I didn't enjoy. And my mind started to wander a bit, hitting record for take 6 for a drummer of some boring song, and I'm sitting there going, well, watching all the hard disks record all the microphones from the drum kit, and thinking this drummer who's basically got a record deal because he's got a nose ring and they're 19 and look cool, but not like they have no musical ability too much. So watching this guy like trying to bang out this really simple beat all sloppy and okay, take 6, and watching the hard disk record, I'm like, how much data is in his brain? How much data is going on the hard disk? And like, why the disparity here? Like, this seems like this is like an inefficient, weird, all just to get claps back together to go onto a CD with much less data again. Like, it seemed like such a weird thing. So I started thinking about, how do you know when drums are real and that drums are fake in the first place? Because, when you hear fake drums, really quick. And why is that? And so I started thinking, well, if you hit a drum and you try to hit it again, you're never going to get the same exact sound out twice. And if you know what a drum sounds like, it's a fake sampled drum if you're hearing that exact same sound over and over. Early drum machines, almost all of them, even MPCs today or whatever, if you hit a pad soft, it's just going to volume scale that sample. So now you're hearing that exact same recording, but just quieter. But if you know a real drum doesn't do that. A real drum is going to have different overtones that are come out. So when you actually hit it harder, it's not just louder. It's different harmonics and different decay are happening, and different sympathetic vibrations if it's a snare and all that. So different things happen with the dynamics or the velocities of striking the drum. It's not just volume scaling. So I thought, well, what if we just recorded hitting the drum a whole bunch of times? And no one had really done that. There were some like velocity splitting libraries out there, but no one had done it extensively like I did for myself here. So literally after that drummer left, I had the assistant go in and just hit every drum like soft to hard. So you just hit the drum a couple hundred times. Okay, next, do the next note, drum, next drum, next drum. And I just recorded that just like we're recording the drummer, all the microphones down, took those files back home to my Pro Tools system and just chopped them all up, just beat detective, just strip all the events apart, and then just trimmed all the fronts and export them all out in sort of multiple pairs, right? So I'd have like an overheads pair and a room mics pair, and then the close mics for like whatever, the snare top, snare bottom, or kick in, kick out, or like whatever tom you're hitting, like that dry close mic. So I basically took all these like 18 channels of mics down to 11 channels of audio, and then was trying to get that to play back. So I made these contact instruments with it. And it was sounding pretty cool. Like, it definitely sounded a lot, just even using your fingers on the keyboard, it just sounded way better than any like CD-ROM of drum samples I had or anything like that. So I was still doing, engineering and sound design programming gigs, and I got a gig doing programming, like, making up, producing, so to speak, is what they'd call it now, right? So producing this track for Pyramind 5000, which is Rob Zombie's little brother. It was the end music for this movie Zoolander. In the movie Zoolander, if you've seen it, the theme is Relax by Frankie Goes to Hollywood, right? So they wanted a kind of like dark vibe kind of cover of it for the end credits. So they got Pyramind 5000, and so it was sort of a rush job. We only had 2 days to do the track. So if you guys know about miking drums and setting up drums and all that, it takes some time. So they told the drummer of the band, there's not going to be time for you to do drums, but it's kind of okay because we want to do like this sort of electronic thing anyway. So he was a little mad that he wasn't going to be involved in it, but he didn't show up to the studio. And so it was the band without him and then me, and so I programmed up electronic beat, and then we were building up the track. I was doing, pad, keyboard sounds and all that, and then the singer says, we decided it was going to go to this more like heavy kind of pre-chorus thing. And the guitar player is doing more of a metal riff and all that, and then the singer goes, well, this would actually be a good part to have some real drums come in. He's like, do you have something that sounds like real drums? And I was like, well, actually, yeah, I have these samples I've been making. So I loaded up like a kind of cheap version of the samples and banged out the drum, and everyone's like, yeah, okay, sounds good. So we used that, and then the second day, which is the last day we had to work on the track, the drummer wants to show up because he wants to feel involved. And so we're playing back what we did the day before, and he gets to the part where the drums come in, and he stands up out of his chair, and he's looking at everyone. He's like, I thought you said there wasn't time for drums. Who'd you get to do drums? And he was like a Berklee School of Music drummer, and like I just realized, they're like, no, it's that guy with his computer in the corner. And I'm like, so he was probably extra mad at that point. But I realized at that point, if you're fooling like a Berklee School of Music drummer, then hey, I must be onto something here, that everyone's happy with it and sounds like real drums, right? So. And then I was using that for other projects. I was doing like demos for this band Sugar Ray, and same thing. The drummer of Sugar Ray, who's involved a lot in the songwriting, he was like, dude, that sounds better than the drums in my home studio. Why don't we just use your samples? But then he'd be like, oh, do you have a different snare? It would be cool to have a different snare. And then that was a lot of work for me because I'd have contact with all these different instruments for every microphone. I'm like selecting all these key zones just to audition a different snare and dragging in all these files. Just a couple minutes. And then, how about that? No, do you have one that's like higher? So it's like a lot of this labor, and I was like, there's got to be an easier way to do this. So I approached a company at the NAMM show, the big music instrument trade show in Los Angeles every year. Approached this company that made this thing called DR008. The company's F Expansion, and they had this, DR008 was like a battery, if you know the software battery. It's basically like a drum grid. You can drag samples onto it. And I approached them about making something that would make my life easier for this, like because they already had like a Velo sampler where you could drag multiple samples in, and it would do velocity splits for you automatically. And I was like, this is cool. All I need is multiple layers of this so I can have my different microphones of the drums. And so I invited the guy over to my house in Los Angeles, and he came over, listened to my samples. He's like, yeah, that sounds good. Do you think you could record a couple more kits? I was like, well, no, these are my drum samples. These are like my secret weapon. I just want the software end. And he's like, no, I think this should be like a product. Like, we'll give you a royalty, of course, and all that. And sort of reluctant about it because in my mind, these were like the cool drum samples that people would hire me to use or something. And then I was like, you know what? There has to be some guaranteed money, I guess, and whatever, sounds fun. So I was like, sure, I'll record a couple more kits. I recorded a couple more kits, and then the software was called BFD, and it sold like hotcakes. Like I had no idea. I didn't expect it coming at all. I mean, it made me a bunch of money, and it was exciting because it was the first time in my life where I had this buffer, because I was always working gig to gig. And then all of a sudden I had this reasonably sized bank account, and I was like, instead of what do I need to do, all of a sudden it was what do I want to do? And I had never stopped and asked myself, and I was 30 years old now and going, what do I want to do? And for me, it was, I want to know how they made that. I want to know how they made this plugin, because I've been using plugins for a decade and a half now, since they came into existence, and I've always felt like it's wizard stuff, and I always, was kind of curious what makes it tick. What the stuff that I know how it sounds, I know how, bit reduction or sample rate reduction or whatever it is, I know how the stuff sounds. What does it look like in code, and what's the math behind it? And so for the first time, I was interested in this stuff. I mean, I was never really interested in math and all of that stuff in school, that's for sure, because I never had an applied use. I never saw a way that it would be cool. But all of a sudden, an XY graph was cool for the first time in my life, because now X is your input and Y is your output, and this curve is how is it going to distort the signal? And it's like, oh my God, an XY graph is now, how are you going to mess up your signal? That's awesome. So I got into it. I got bit by the bug of programming really quick too. It was just, I got the example gain plugin to compile, and then I was chatting with a programmer friend online, and I was like, okay, how do I make this gain? It's just a simple plugin that just has one slider for volume. And I was like, well, how do I make this gain plugin do bit reduction instead? And he's like, oh, well, that's pretty easy. What you do is, your audio signal. Let me find a little just visual demonstration here so you can see how long, you have an audio signal, and you have 44,000 samples a second or whatever it is. And then these audio samples have a value between silence, zero crossing, and your maximum value would be 1. And then your minimum value, or maximum negative value, would be -1. So you have this number between -1 and 1, and it's a floating point number, right? It's a bunch of decimal places. So usually it'd be like 0.555 or whatever it is. So he's like, what you do is you take this number and you multiply it up by a number, so it's bigger, right? Let's say you multiply it by 10. So now we're between -10 and 10. Then you cast that to an integer, or in other words, we're rounding it or getting rid of all the decimal places. So now it's exactly 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. It's exactly one of these numbers. So we're just rounding off that stuff. Then you divide it back down by the number you multiplied it up by. So now it's, again, between this -1 and 1 range, but it's now basically 1.0, 0.9, 0.8, 0.7. It's one of these exact steps and nothing else but exactly one of those steps. He's like, that's your bit reduction, because now you've just quantized the signal to be one of these 20 possibilities instead of one of these million possibilities. So it's giving it that crunchy sound. So I'm looking at 3 lines of code, input, multiplied, input, rounded, input, divided back down, and and I compile it, and it works, and I have this slider, and now it's making the sound crunchier or less crunchy. It's bit reduction. And I was just instantly bit by the bug. Like, I can't believe I'm looking at the 3 lines of code that are compiling into making this plugin run. Yeah, it's kind of wizard stuff still, but I'm understanding it. And I was so excited that I could understand it, and that I was like in control of, now I can try to make it do something slightly different, or I can start messing with it from there. So had some money from the BFD saved up, and so I just went for it. I just decided to make my own plugins. And so I made a little free plugin or 2. I took that bit reduction, turned it into something called Bitmodder, where you could do bit reduction and sample rate reduction, and then multiply the difference of those 2 signals, which was just weird. It just kind of got ring moddy. And then that was just some freebie that's long gone and lost. And then I made Lucifer was my first real big plugin, so I spent probably a year on it. And I don't think it paid for my year involved on it, but I learned a lot. And so Lucifer was like a beat repeat type of plugin, but before Ableton had beat repeat. So it allowed you to mangle loops or mangle audio in real time. You could just throw it on a track, it would sync to the host tempo, and you could play a MIDI keyboard and get different quarter note repeats, eighth note repeats. If you guys know beat repeat, that's kind of what it would do, but you could also do graph rearrange stuff. There are some other plugins since then that have done similar things, like Buffer Shuffler is a very similar thing, where you have a diagonal line and you can kind of re-scramble your audio in a loop-based way. So that was Lucifer, and like I said, it didn't really make me a lot of money, but it gave me insight into the whole process of essentially set up a website, and you can have people send you money, and you can give them downloads, and you can make them updates, and you can have your software get cracked and pirated, and you can have email exchanges with customers that are cool people out there that use your stuff, that respect what you do and are willing to pay you for it. And so I had this one customer in particular who's a DJ out in New York called Jonathan Peters. Jonathan's he never got well known outside of New York, but he was a local celebrity essentially in New York because he was a resident in the later days of the Sound Factory. And Sound Factory was like a legendary club in New York that was open. It was kind of a gay club predominantly. The owner was gay, and they put on these flamboyant parades and stuff like that, so to speak, like shows inside the club. But it was a nightclub, disco, dance music, all of that. And it was the hot spot. It was only open Saturday because they'd spend the whole rest of the week preparing their whole skits and everything for the one night. So it was always sort of sold out and lying around the block kind of a place. They got shut down from some drug thing, and when they were shut down, that's when his career really started to take off in a sense, because people missed the Sound Factory, but they knew who he was, so they'd follow him to other venues, and he would play there, same kind of music and all that. Anyway, so Jonathan, and I didn't know who he was or anything like that, but he bought my software and called me up saying, this is amazing. I just built this $4,000 MIDI hardware controller dedicated to your plugin so I can use it live, because this is always what I've wanted to do, is to be able to flip the beat around, do the beat repeat kind of stuff, or rearrange the music live, like in a real-time kind of context. So he was excited by that. He was using Ableton early days DJing, and so he said, I want to fly you out to New York, show you what I do. So he flew me out there, and that was when I really got exposed to the DJ thing. I mean, this was 2003, 2004, and I had checked out of dance music long before that, because to me dance music wasn't cool. It was M1 organ patch and like 909 hi-hat and some like diva vocal, and it was just nothing that it never spoke to me as like cool or synthesizer laden or anything like that. And I realized that I had been missing what had been happening, because he for one thing that he did for me was to turn me on to the cool tribal and early electro and progressive house that was like starting to bubble up and take shape. And then another thing he turned me on to was Beatport, because Beatport was in its early infancy at that time. And I was like, what's that? And he's like, well, it's like iTunes for DJs. And he had like floor to ceiling, like 30-foot ceilings with like the ladder on wheels and the whole thing of vinyl. And he's like, oh, I used to spin all that, but now it's all just files that I get on Beatport. So what's Beatport? Well, it's like iTunes, but for DJs. So, oh, interesting. So I was checking it out, and then I'd been working on my own music, and it was really just sort of like a fun thing. I was kind of considered the software more of my like work or passion of that sense, but I've always enjoyed making music, and I've always done it as a hobby. And so I was making stuff with a buddy I'd met online, and turned him on to, I was chatting with him when I was over at Jonathan's place in New York, and I was like, have you ever heard of Beatport? And he's like, heard of it, why? And I was like, dude, listen to the top 10. Like, we could make this just for fun. So, because we were kind of already just making music for fun. So we're like, okay. So we made a sort of a joke track, just like using what we heard in the top 10, which was like, side chain. It was very obvious. There's like side chaining, sawtooth bass, and you've got the 4/4 kick and 128 BPM, and just these things that we heard, like, oh yeah, dude. So we just made it as a joke. I put some like Macintosh talking voices over it, and that was this song called "This Is the Hook," and it was kind of lighthearted. We weren't really hating on the whole scene, but we were definitely outsiders to it. And Pete Tong played it on his Radio 1 show. It went to #1 on Beatport. So like we were sort of like couldn't believe it in a sense, because no money behind it, no name behind it, and it was just BSOD. This is the hook, and so totally not taking ourselves seriously. And so my friend was Joel. He goes by Deadmau5, and he saw that happen, of course, and he had no money and anything like that. So he really changed what he was doing, because he was making a lot of music and every day. He was making songs every day, but it was very eclectic. I mean, he'd do breaks tracks, he'd do trance, he'd do kind of little of everything. And then once that happened, he just completely shifted into the 128 BPM, 4/4 kick drum, like, okay, I got this, is kind of what he said. And sure enough, he did, because he had a number of #1s right after that. Faxing Berlin, Not Exactly, Our Guru, some of his early tracks. And then he had sort of a meteoric rise, and I would go around with him to his shows, and people would see that I was with him, and they're like, where'd this guy come from? Like, he came out of nowhere. I'm like, no, he didn't come out of nowhere, because I had been friends with him for 6-7 years at that point, and so I'd been watching him make music every day. I'd wake up in the morning, and he would have been up all night, and he's like, send me a track on Instant Messenger. Here's a track I made, and I play it. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe you just made that. And while I'm listening to it, I see the instant message blinking again. He's like, oh, and here's another I made. Send me another. Like, okay, you made 2 tracks while I was sleeping? Okay, awesome. Cool. So just one of those prolific guys, and I always kind of pushed him, like, dude, you've got to do this for a living, because it was really clear. I'd seen enough to know that he was special in that ability to be prolific and creative in a way that I struggled with, because I always thought that I was more of a perfectionist. I think I was never happy with things being good enough, so to speak. And Joel's taught me a lot about just being able to hear something in your head, which I always kind of work that way as well. But like, you hear something, you go for it, and when it's close, you move on to another facet. You don't like obsess over this one detail, because if you obsess over this one detail, you're going to lose the big picture. And so that was something that he never verbalized to me, but just working with him and watching him work is something that was really valuable to see both sides of that, because it's really easy with all these tools to get distracted. You can, it's the more that the music comes from within you, and the more that you know what you're going for, the easier it is to find it. I mean, the first time I started working with music, we worked on a lot of music apart, so we weren't in person together, and there was a little bit of mystery there. Once I sat down with him together and we were working on music together, I saw certain habits from him that I'd worked with a lot of different guys in studios. Like, I wasn't green to working with other people, but he had some really weird things that he did that I had never seen people do before. One of them was just to fly through samples. I mean, like if we were looking for a kick drum, it was just next, like, and then boom, and just one, why that one? Like, dude, you didn't even let it finish playing, and you threw it in the track. And it took me a while, like, to realize, like, he'd already made up his mind. In his head, he already knew the sound of the kick drum that he wanted, and he just was waiting to find the one that was close enough of a match. And when he found one that was close, yep, okay, that'll do, and threw it in there. And then you're done with the kick drum for now. Like, now we're on to the next thing. Not, okay, let's obsess over putting some compressors and some EQ and trying to make this kick drum the best kick drum ever. And it's like, no, just throw that in there, and it's close enough, and you move it on. And if you repeat that for your claps and your snare and your hat and your bass and your lead and all that stuff, there's something, I think, kind of magic happens, even though each one may only be 80% of your vision, and it's close enough, but something when all the synergy that forms from all these different elements doing 80% of what you wanted them to do, you can start to really hear the intent, I think. It starts to percolate through. So anyway, that was one of the valuable things, a little bit on the side, but that was something valuable I learned from him. So no one really expected deadmau5 to become what it was, and that was a whole new sort of chapter of my life, because we were sort of best friends just from on the internet, always just sort of goofing around and chatting every day online. And we'd try to scheme some certain things. We were going to, like, make a sample CD together, and then that didn't happen. And then once he got big, it was like, oh, well, he's sort of like, now he has some money, and he's like, well, why don't I hire you and let's make that sample CD? And it was all kind of funny, because it was the other way around before. It was I was going to hire him to move to LA and do the sample CD, and he's like, well, tables are turned. I'm like, yeah, cool. But definitely was great, and he's always been, like, top notch in terms of, like, being fair, because not only would he, like, put me on a salary to make it, and he'd split the back end with me and all that. So it's kind of almost too fair. It's sort of like, no, let's just make this 50-50, dude. Come on. So anyway, yeah, we ended up making a sample CD together, which was kind of mostly my work, but we did what we could together. But he was touring pretty heavy during that time, so I kind of hunkered down and did most of, like, the loops and polishing of it, and that did well. Actually, did quite well, more than I think we expected in sales. And then so it was sort of like, okay, well, let's do another one. And then both of us were like, it's just not inspiring to just make another sample CD. So I think it was him that said, like, why don't we make a plugin that goes with the sample CD? So you buy the sample CD, you get this free plugin, and so probably this plugin should work with, like, loops and one-shots and stuff like that, and allow you to, like, you know, make beats out of them or something like that. So that ended up becoming Nerve, and it made sense on my year or so I spent on Nerve to make it marketed as a product, as a software, and not as a sample CD with a free plugin. So it's sort of marketed in reverse, right? Instead of being a sample CD with a free plugin, it's a plugin with free samples that comes with it. And we actually ended up not making the sample CD, so it comes with the first sample CD. And then it also comes with a lot of other sounds that I got from some various sound designers to contribute, so patterns and kits and all that. And so Nerve, I'm pretty happy with. I use it in my live sets. It's a great, like, compact way to get beats made. Part of the idea was something that doesn't take up your whole screen, because I had previously designed one with FXpansion called Guru, and Guru was great, and it was a lot of what I initially anticipated. But one thing both Joel and I found ourselves never using it, and one reason is that it sort of just invaded your whole screen. It took up, you know, kind of the whole thing, so you couldn't kind of just have your beat laying somewhere and still deal with arrangements and stuff like that. But with Nerve, I really wanted everything compact and focused. So if you want the filter there, the filter's right there. You don't have to page to find it, or whatever it is you want to be able to do, trim a sample or something like that. It's all, like, kind of right there, so you can zoom in and trim your sample or whatever. But yeah, anyway, Nerve's been good. It was a fun experience. So that was sort of my next thing. And by that point, with Nerve, I we needed a way to sell it. We had marketed, I should say, the sample CD as Xfer, which is the label that I started with Joel for releasing our own music on Beatport. And then I had the website up or the domain available and all that, so I just decided to make Nerve an Xfer product. And it made sense. It made sense to do that because it was with Joel especially, that it was sort of our thing that we did together. So yeah, Nerve was great. It sold pretty well. And not amazing. It didn't really have Dead Mouse branding or anything like that, so it didn't get that sort of like landslide sales, but it paid for my time involved in it, and I've been happy with it, and I still develop it from time to time when I can. But I've gotten a little distracted by the newer ones that I've made. So LFO Tool was the next one. LFO Tool is an effect plugin that I developed for Joel at his request, basically, because Joel got all into the modular synths, and he wanted something that he would be able to send CV out, control voltage signals out to control the modular synth. And there's a plugin out there that this company Expert Sleepers makes that's like allows you to send LFO to your modular synths or whatnot, and that's really handy because the LFO is going to sync up to your host tempo, right? So now you have like a beat synced LFO. Otherwise, with the analog world, you're just kind of loose and free. So it's nice to have that bridge connection where you can now make your analog synth do something that's really tight and on the beat. But that plugin only allowed for like triangle, saw, sine, square, something like that with LFOs. And he's like, Steve, how hard would it be to make a plugin where you could like draw your own LFO shape? And I was like, well, no, it wouldn't be too hard. And it wasn't. The hardest part for me was just figuring out how to do this kind of tension curve stuff because I had never done that before. And to make it run efficient on the CPU. But it really wasn't very hard at all. After I had made it, I decided I didn't want to sell it as a CV generator because that's sort of a nightmare with tech support, and it's also a limited market, right? Because how many people have analog synths that they want to hook up the CV and all that? So I decided just to, well, what can I make it do besides send a CV signal out? Well, I should make an effect instead and let it process audio. And so volume is an obvious one, right? And panning, it's pretty easy. It's like volume for the two speakers. And then a filter. So I threw in a basic filter with like cutoff and resonance controls. So that way you can get the graph or multiple graphs to control those various parameters. And so that's what it was. What I didn't really anticipate, just as a sort of a whim, as I was messing around kind of making it, I realized, oh, you can simulate like a pumping sidechain compression or that kind of volume pumping. It's really easy to do with a graph, and that allows you to draw it in. So I just made like these sidechain presets as a whim, and that ends up being pretty much what everyone uses it for. I mean, it's pretty much just like this draw your own sidechain, auto sidechain compressor thing. So I didn't really anticipate that, but it's been wildly popular. I mean, this thing has sold way more than I expected. I thought it would be this little boutique fringe thing, but it's become quite a staple. So yeah, I've kept updating LFO Tool. I've added more stuff into it, like a beat synced oscilloscope and a bunch of all the various filter types, format filters and stuff like that. So that allows you to do a bit more with it than just basic volume pumping. Although I think still most people just use it for that. But LFO Tool I actually use all the time myself. This is the one plugin that I've made that I am using religiously because I've ended up accidentally in my career path, I've accidentally kind of found myself as a mix engineer. I mix a lot of EDM tracks and a lot of pop EDM crossover stuff like Will.i.am stuff like the Justin Bieber track he did or whatever, a lot of different EDM artists and stuff like that. So as a mixer, it's a really valuable tool, I find, because it's great for doing any kind of automated volume thing that allows you to still retain that sculptability that you wouldn't get if you were doing it as graph automation, where of course you can draw something right in the timeline like this, and you can of course duplicate it to the beat or whatever you want. But if you decide you want to tweak that a little, then you're going to have to go duplicate that out again. Or in live, you can do clip-based automation, but you don't necessarily have clips, right? If someone's giving you these big stem files and they might have cuts in it or whatever the case. So LFO Tool is really nice to be able to just sort of sculpt in a depth, and I use it. So I use it all the time for a bunch of things. One is shortening kick drums, because almost everyone's kick drums are too long, and I find that I can get a better mix. It's one of my myriad of mix tricks. I could talk about mixing for quite some time, but one of my big mix tricks is creating space. And one way to create space is, of course, with time. That's one of our big dimensions, right? So if you can shorten sounds, the more you're going to create space for the next sound to be interesting. So I'm almost always shortening sounds because people's desires don't always line up with the result. And people's desires, of course, people want things as big as possible. And you solo a kick drum, you're going to favor the long kick drum. But in the context of having this busy bass part and stuff like that, the big kick drum is no longer very valuable or desired. So I'll be shortening people's kicks. If it's a really like housey track and busy, I'll shorten them as much as down to the 8th note, which looks something like that. Or a lot of the time it's somewhere in between. I'll be doing something like that, just fading it down somewhere along the way. Another thing I'll use it for is triggering, is a similar thing, is making sounds more punchy, because it's a very similar concept, but a lot of samples you'll get on sample CDs and stuff like that have been really like squashed. They've ran it through limiters or multiband compressor or who knows what to make it this like really loud brick. But I find that that's not always what you want in terms of the sound. For instance, tom hits, right? I like a lot of thwack. I like a lot of like dynamic to hit and move, and then you get back 6 dB or 10 dB or something like that for the sustain part, so the actual body of the sound can be down low. So we have this instant snap burst, and you can do a bit of that with like transient plugins and that kind of a thing. But using something like LFO Tool really lets you sculpt the amount of time in there, and it lets you see it a bit visually as well. As also you get more accuracy potentially, because you can do MIDI triggering with this like retrig feature. So you can just basically transcribe the events, and it's pretty easy because you'll see the events on the stem of the audio file, and so you're just placing MIDI notes where those same events hit, routing that MIDI to LFO Tool, and then it will re-trigger this graph every time coming in. So I use that a lot for that, and there's other ways. Obviously for the sidechain pumping, you can use it for that, and I have done that as well. Anyway, yeah, so I get a lot of mileage out of that. And it did well. Cthulhu was my next plugin, and this is like sort of a creative chord generator and arpeggiator plugin. It was actually 2 separate plugins. I had made the ARP first, actually, and I had not a good name for it. I called it XARP, like X for ARP, and it looked sort of like this, but different color scheme. I just cannibalized Nerve's graph and made it into a pattern-based arpeggiator. So you feed MIDI chords in, and then it's going to play those out as an arpeggio. And anyway, it's pretty in-depth. I won't go into all what it does. But then separately, the Cthulhu part was Joel's idea. He wanted something to be able to have a chord memorizer, because you can get creative results out rather than trying to move blocks of chords in a piano roll around, which is kind of cumbersome. What if I just had a way to learn in chord A, chord B, chord C, chord D, and now I can just play the different notes on the MIDI keyboard and experiment with a different rhythm or a different order of those chords or that kind of a thing, or even just some random unexpected things can happen if you load in a bunch of chords. So I made it for him because it was easy, and then after that, of course, decided to sell it because why not? And so I fed in basically all the Bach chorales because I was just looking for some MIDI source that I knew would have a lot of chords in it. And studying music theory in college, maybe it paid off here because I knew all the Bach chorales were basically 4 notes at a time, block chords, so they feed in as MIDI files really well, which you can load in your own with the Learn switch. Or there's an import MIDI in there now as well. So that was the other half of Cthulhu. So you can enable both, and then you get your chords going into the arpeggiator. And Cthulhu's done really great as well. I mean, for the amount of time I spent on it, which was probably 4 weeks, 5 weeks of time, it's well paid for my time involved in it, which is great. And I didn't quite expect it. And a lot of my friends who also make plugins are really surprised when I give them my sales figures on it, because they're like, a MIDI plugin? Who would have thought? Like who would have thought there's a market for that? But I've been pleased by that, and I see big names even today. I see big names buying it, and so that's pretty funny or great, whatever. But I'm all for it because it allows you to come up with creative things that you might not have, and it's close to my heart because it's musical. It comes up with like harmony and arpeggio, harmony and melody kind of stuff, rather than just make stuff sound fat or whatever. So. It's a compositional aid or compositional tool, I think. So that's Cthulhu, and Cthulhu really inspired me by the fact that it's kind of sold well for the amount of time I'd put into it. Really inspired me to dream bigger, you could say. Go, wow, what if I really spent time on something that's like, instead of like a few weeks, what if I spent like a couple years or something on something real? And so that was Serum. Essentially, I designed Serum. I started it when I was DJing on the Mothership tour with Skrillex, and I was on the bus with those guys and watching them Dylan Francis and Alvin Risk and Sonny and 12th Planet and all these guys were like, making music on the bus with the laptops, and they were all using, the standard soft synths that everyone's using. And I kind of wished I had something to offer them or give them or show them as an alternative, but I didn't. I had never made a synth. So that really is what set me over the edge. Like, okay, I want to make my own synth. That's like the frontier I've never crossed. That's the thing I've never learned how to do. And it was quite a learning experience, quite a journey, because there's a lot of things about synthesis. Some of the stuff I had done with Nerve, with the drum machine and playing back samples, came in handy, but this was on a whole different level of quality you have to pay attention to if you want your sound to sound good at all frequencies and all pitches. And so it took me a while, and I ended up giving up. I'm just not a calculus whiz and all that. I never even studied calculus. So I hired a mathematician to get me to the finish line with the oscillator playback quality that I wanted, which was at first I just wanted to rival the synths that are out there, and then at the end of it I wanted to beat them. I was sort of hell-bent on like, no, why not have the best possible playback quality? And ideally without too much CPU use, but I was willing to spend more CPU just to be able to have a synth that you could say, okay, this one is the cleanest, is the lowest aliasing points and all that of any of the ones out there. So there's a lot of labor of love in Serum. There's a lot of things that I just really didn't think about what's going to sell a lot of copies of a synth, but what is the synth that I want? It's the real reason that I make software is if it was to make money, I'd probably make databases for banks or like hospital software or something like that. If you want to make money programming, there's probably easier ways. But for me, it's the labor of love and being able to make the thing that I want to make. And so I to a large degree, ignored what I thought would sell. I was more worried about something that I would feel proud in, and that I could sort of recommend to people and feel confident in that it's standing up, holding its own or whatever, or at least has unique things to offer that they're not going to get somewhere else, which is hard to do in the crowded market of soft synths. If you guys know the market, there's a lot of software synthesizers out there, free and otherwise. So with Serum, there's a few things that there's a few synths. Obviously, Massive has a lot in common with it. Pretty much everyone I knew was using Massive a little bit, at least. And so with Massive, there was a lot of things that I thought were shortcomings that I wanted to sort of improve upon in it. You're limited to a fixed number of wavetables, and there's no way out of this fixed list unless you get really hacky, and that's not really something that most people would want to do. And then there's a lot of things like the envelopes. They don't even let you see time. You're like, how long is this attack? I don't know. I would have to listen, and that always kind of bothered me. LFOs and stuff like that, they're cool, but if you want to have your own shape, it's sort of like, well, no, I don't want that own shape. No, that's not the one I want. There's no way to really make your own shape, so that kind of annoyed me. And I just felt like a lot of stuff could be a little bit more visual as well. You can set up these modulations, and I really like the system they use for this, so I kind of borrowed that. There's other synths that use the same kind of thing. But you never get to see where the actual position is when you're playing back. You just know it's somewhere between there and there, but you don't know actually where it is. So so I spent a lot of time on the user interface with Serum. There's actually more lines of code, more hours spent on what you see and your interaction there than the actual DSP that makes the sound. So a lot of that is I think what was worthwhile. I actually redid the interface 3 times on the way, and it went from incredibly ugly to where we are now on it. So yeah, basically I solved those things I was talking about to the most degree. You've got unlimited wavetables. These are the ones that come with it, but you can load in your own wavetables. There's of course more visual on them as well. There's real-time manipulations of the wavetables, which is something you get with Massive as well, but there's no visual over it, right? So if I want to use like this bend feature, I have this knob that controls the bend feature, but I don't see any change. Whereas here with the bend, you can really kind of see what it's doing to the sound. So yeah, trying to keep things more visual. And more of them, of course, I kind of tried to get creative with different ways to mangle the wavetable in real time. And hopefully I'll add some more as well in there, because there's definitely more possibilities, as well as build your own with these remaps. So if you have an idea for how you want the wavetable to get altered, you can kind of make your own shape or save that as a shape preset and stuff like that. So it goes pretty deep in terms of what you can do with mangling the sound. And then you can have, like I said, unlimited wavetables, really. You can bring in your own sounds. So you could have someone speaking, or you could have a bass sound or something like that, and you can drag that in, and it'll analyze it. It'll break it apart into its various frames that make up the sound. So you can see there, just dragging in like bass one shots, and you can see it breaks it into these. In this case, it's averaging the pitch that it sees in the file, and then it's using that as a constant frame size. In other words, it's slicing the audio file into similar sized or equal sized chunks, and that's what we end up seeing for these different tables here. In case that's confusing, I don't want to lose y'all, so I can show you that another way, which would be like, here's that bass sound. And if we look at the bass sound, you can see the repeating period of it, right? This is the frequency that we'd be hearing of the sound, and you can see it repeating in this similar pattern. So just like you have with auto-tune or something, or Melodyne or whatever, it's I'm building a pitch map of how the pitch changes over time, and then I'm just actually averaging in that. So it ends up calculating, hopefully, it ends up calculating this period length from there to there. And then it's using that as a basis to slice. So as you see this table, we might see, I don't know, 20 or 30 different tables there from left to right. We can look at what Serum's done, bringing in that same sound, and you can see there, those 30 tables. So it's divided for us, and we'd probably never do that otherwise. And this allows us to do things, now that it's wavetable based, that we wouldn't really do it with a sample, such as freeze on any one wave cycle, or create interpolated or morphed tables. In other words, we could create sound that didn't exist in the original sample by creating interpolations or spectral morphs of the neighboring tables. So the in-betweens that don't exist, it can create those. So now we have those added in there. So now we have even smoother animation, you could say, between the different things. And now, of course, we can play with time. We could go backwards through the sound, forwards through the time, use an LFO to loop us around in the sound or anything like that. So for me, it was sort of an uncharted frontier. Obviously, with wavetable synth-like Massive, you had the ability to do this sort of scrubbing around in a wavetable, but you had no ability to really create your own. And so that was sort of the impetus of of Serum, and tried to really just reinvent everywhere I could. I just broke down any time I was doing something, I wanted to add a little bit of flair or uniqueness to it. It's something that you get the luxury of doing, I guess, when it's your own instrument, is kind of call the shots, right, and make your own decisions. But I did things like the sub-oscillator has less than perfect wave cycles, so these are all a little bit analog-ish. They're not the exact raw shape, but the sine is a little bit extra harmonic on it, and same with the triangle, and so on and so forth. And so I got some tips from a friend of mine, Andrew Simper, who's does the glue, if you know the glue compressor and all that. He's my mentor, because he's a DSP genius and helped me out a lot with various facets, including all these filters I licensed from him. They're like his college filters, which I wouldn't be able to code today, but they're his student filters, but they sound great. I've actually worked on them a bit and improved them a little bit. They're great sounding filters, I think. They're not trying to be analog, but yeah, there's that. So anyway, yeah, that's more or less my journey to the present. This is, I guess, my 4th commercial synth now that I sell on Extra Records. My typical day is sitting at home alone working on software, and the support hasn't been too bad, and I do some tech support and that kind of a thing, but most of my time is spent on bug fixing if there's bugs to be fixed, or developing new features if that so comes up, and then maybe slowly developing new products, although right now all of my energy is going into Serum and adding the myriad of things that people would love to see added to it.